Senator Bellemare.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, I will try to be brief, but I want to speak at third reading on Bill C-30. But before I begin, I would like to congratulate all my colleagues who spoke before me on this budget bill. The speeches have all been very interesting and have raised important issues. I share many of the concerns that have been identified, particularly those that relate to the lack of a thorough study of this bill in committee. As I told Minister Freeland in Committee of the Whole, I will vote in favor of this bill. Nevertheless, I would like to share some concerns that could be the subject of further study in the future. My comments are intended to take a critical yet constructive look at the government strategy for dealing with this period of inflation. Several colleagues who spoke yesterday at second reading recalled the expert diagnosis of the causes of the inflation we have been experiencing for over a year now. All major international research institutes, such as the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, central banks, such as the Bank of Canada, as well as the macroeconomic experts that the Senate Standing Committee on Banking has been hearing over the past few weeks on the state of the economy, agree that the causes of inflation are linked to problems related to supply chains. In other words, current inflation is a supply rather than a demand problem. Hence, were it not for the disruptions in supply chains since 2020, there would be no inflation beyond the central bank's targets. The supply of goods and services has been disrupted by a combination of factors such as the temporary halt in production caused by the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, as well as special climatic conditions that have reduced the production of certain commodities. We all hope that these factors are temporary in nature. That is why central banks have said that inflation will be temporary. The OECD, in its latest September report, still holds that the causes of inflation are temporary. According to the OECD Economic Outlook, inflation is hitting the global economy and has spread beyond the food and energy sectors, but will ease. However, some gas supply problems particularly may persist, mainly due to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. For the time being, as the central banks have confirmed, inflationary expectations are not running high. And the witnesses we have heard from so far, the Banking Committee have confirmed that there is no wage inflation in Canada. However, despite the fact that this inflation may be temporary, prices that have risen are likely to remain at their higher level. In other words, even if price increases stabilize, they will still be higher than in the past. It will take a lot of competition in the markets for prices to come down. And as wages rise in many sectors to maintain purchasing power, price drops become less likely. In short, when inflation stabilizes, it will be at a higher price level. And I insist on that, and you'll see why. Inflation is having a negative impact, particularly on the most vulnerable citizens who generally have fixed incomes. And Bill C-30 is aimed at individuals and families whose incomes are not rising much and who are struggling to make ends meet. But it also creates winners. Among those winners, we have governments, especially the federal government, whose revenues are increasing due to inflation. This is the case with the revenue from the goods and services tax, which have increased significantly and most likely permanently.
Now let's talk about strategies recommended by the OECD and experts to get through this temporary period of inflation. The main measure suggested is to reduce overall demand in order to alleviate price pressures caused by supply problems. This is why authorities, such as the OECD and the Monetary Fund, are advocating for higher interest rates to reduce demand and thus alleviate price pressures. And this is exactly what the Bank of Canada is doing. Moreover, to relieve the most vulnerable, these same organizations are proposing the adoption of temporary income transfer measures to support the purchasing power of low-income people. This is exactly what the federal government and Canada's central bank are doing. Bill C-30 follows the logic recommended by the OECD. But is this strategy effective? Are there alternatives? Many are beginning to question this strategy. There are different instruments to temporarily reduce demand. Monetary policy is not the only instrument. In a context of inflation caused by supply chain problems, the use of monetary policy can be very costly. It's like using aggressive chemotherapy for a localized cancer at an early stage. It can kill the patient. Several economists consider this strategy dangerous. Witnesses at the Banking Committee to date have expressed their doubts. David Dodge, former governor of the Bank of Canada, clearly stated that in the medium term, we should be focusing on increasing supply, and acknowledged that in the short term, fiscal measures could also help reduce demand. Professor Tom from University of Alberta, who was just quoted, his research paper also questions the perverse effects of interest rates in curbing supply-side inflation. According to his study and others he cited, higher interest rates can cause boomerang effects on the inflation rate. Economist Jim Stafford also shared his concerns about using monetary policy to curb inflation. In fact, a rapid and substantial rise in interest rates will reduce demand, but it may also exacerbate the rise in rents and other prices and services. It could even affect the ability of our production system to solve supply problems and support the necessary investments related to climate change. The only advantage of using monetary policy to reduce demand is that it is quick. It also relieves elected officials of this responsibility. As for the temporary measures to support household incomes, also advocated by the OECD, they are, by definition, temporary. It is questionable whether they have a real therapeutic effect on the most vulnerable, given that many people, as mentioned yesterday here, do not file tax returns and cannot benefit from them. They are nevertheless politically visible, and the cost is temporary. I consulted the latest financial reports from the Department of Finance, including the Fiscal Monitor March 2022 financial results. For the year 2021-22, GST revenue was $45.5 billion, an increase of 48.9% over the previous year. Of course, inflation is not the only reason for this increase in revenue. It's also explained by a return to normal consumption after COVID. However, if one compares the year 2021-22 to the pre-COVID years, there is still a significant increase in GST revenues. The annually published financial reference tables show that for the 2019-2020 fiscal year, that is, the year before COVID, GST revenues were $37.4 billion. And it's always about that figure it was always about that figure in the years prior to COVID. When one compares the pre-COVID year with the year ending March 31st, 2022, one notices a revenue increase for the federal government of $6.1 billion. That's 21.7%. This increase is permanent. When inflation stabilizes, GST revenues will increase at a slower rate, but they will remain high, and they will not decrease. From this perspective, then, Bill C-30, which provides temporary assistance worth $2.6 billion, and that according to the Office of the Parliamentary Budget Officer study, is a very modest measure in relation to the government's increased GST revenues. The government could have done a little more and perhaps made the assistance permanent, because those people's incomes will not increase, but prices will. It could also have the government could also have temporarily reduced the GST by an amount equivalent to the revenue increase. A GST cut would have impacted inflation, as it would have lowered the cost of the consumer basket. France, like other European countries, has chosen to reduce electricity and gas tariffs. According to a study by the French Institute of Statistics, this measure will have reduced the inflation rate by 3 percentage points. It will have allowed an inflation rate of 5.1% instead of more than 8%. That's important. All in all, the federal government has followed OECD recommendations, which suggest temporary income support measures rather than tax cuts. But is this enough for less affluent Canadian households who are struggling to make ends meet? I'm not sure it is. Also, it is the same groups, the low-income groups, that will bear a large part of the economic costs of monetary policy, because monetary policy lowers interest rates but creates other problems. As you know, Canada's monetary policy will slow the economy, and the slowdown has already begun. This is the case in the U.S., where technically we're already experiencing 2 consecutive quarters of output contraction. It's usually the most vulnerable groups that bear the brunt of an economic downturn. And as you know, a downturn is accompanied by job losses. EI benefits will increase, and once again, lower income workers and small businesses will pay proportionately more than others. Is this fair? To ask the question is to answer it. Finally, like other senators, such as Senator Dupuis, I would have liked to know which government studies led it to choose the current strategy, and I would have liked to know the regional impacts and the GBA plus impacts of such a strategy. Nevertheless, all in all, we could be more creative in the future. I will vote in favor of Bill C-30 nonetheless. Families need it, but I think we could have done more. I believe that budgetary measures of this nature, however, are only a short-term painkiller to alleviate the effects of a problem that requires strategic supply-side measures to responsibly and sustainably address supply issues. And I call on the government to demonstrate its strategy, its supply-side strategy. Thank you for listening.
Senator Pau, you have a question?
Senator Bellemare, would you take a question? I very much enjoyed your discussion of alternative economic models, and just wanted to ask you about your recommendation of a GST cut as opposed to the measures in this bill. There's merit to the argument, and you've pointed out that some other countries are doing it, but would you not say that the main difference between an across-the-board GST cut and the doubling of the GST credit is, of course, in its distributional impact, whereas an across-the-board cut would benefit all consumers, but the credit increase would benefit a targeted group of lower income Canadians. Thank you. That was the speech.
Sénatrice Bellemare.
Senator Bellemare, your time is up unless you asked for the Chamber's consent. I request the consent.
Senators, so that Senator Bellemare will answer the question.
Senator Bellemare, you have leave. Thank you for providing leave. Yes, indeed, Senator Wu, I completely agree with you that in both cases, the effects would not be the same. And I can't tell you ahead of time what they will be. What we do know is that the GST tax credit will be done via the tax return, and a large number of the most vulnerable, and that's what we heard yesterday in the speeches, a large proportion do not file a tax return. It's a very short temporary measure. Reducing the GST rate would have cost a lot more. However, it would have removed pressure on the Bank of Canada to more quickly increase interest rates. Therefore, the benefits of reducing the GST would not only fall on consumers, but also would reduce macroeconomic costs in an inflation-fighting strategy that's not designed to fight supply problems. It could even exacerbate supply problems. And that's where we really have a problem, a very particular problem, and we need to do something. If we reduce demand to decrease inflation, we need a plan.